July 25th, 1944, 11:02 hours. St. Lo, Normandy, France. The earth trembled first. Not the irregular shudder of artillery, familiar to every soldier who had endured the bombardments of the previous 7 weeks, but something different, a deep, sustained vibration that rose through the soles of boots and traveled up spines like a premonition. Oberstfreiter Klaus Hartmann pressed himself deeper into the trench wall, his fingers clawing at the Norman clay that had been his home and prison since the invasion began. The morning had started with an aerial bombardment of such ferocity that it seemed designed to erase the landscape itself. 3,000 aircraft, Lancasters and Fortresses and Liberators, had turned the sky black and dropped their payloads in a carpet that walked across the German positions with the inevitability of a tidal wave. The bombs had fallen for 90 minutes, each explosion merging with the next until individual detonations became meaningless, and there was only one continuous roar that obliterated thought and reduced men to cowering animals waiting for death. Now the bombing had stopped, but the trembling had not. It grew stronger, more rhythmic, accompanied by a sound like distant thunder that refused to fade. Hartmann raised his head above the trench parapet, squinting through the dust and smoke that hung over the battlefield like fog. What he saw made no sense at first. The landscape itself seemed to be moving, a wall of steel and dust advancing across the cratered fields with mechanical precision. Then the shapes resolved themselves into individual forms, and he understood, though understanding brought no comfort. Tanks. American tanks. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, stretching from horizon to horizon in waves that seemed to have no end, their treads churning through the bomb-cratered earth, their engines producing that thunder that had preceded them like the growl of some primordial beast. Sherman tanks. He had heard of them, had seen intelligence reports describing them as inferior to German panzers, under-armored and undergunned, machines that could be destroyed with proper anti-tank tactics, and German superiority in armored warfare. But the reports had said nothing about this, about the sheer weight of numbers, about the suffocating inevitability of a steel tide that advanced not with tactical finesse, but with the brute certainty of industrial mass made manifest. The leading tanks were perhaps 400 meters away now, close enough that he could see the white stars painted on their hulls, close enough to hear the squeal of their treads and the deeper rumble of their engines. Behind them came infantry, tiny figures moving in the shadow of the armor, and behind the infantry came more tanks, and more, until the mind refused to count and could only stare. Hartmann dropped back into the trench and looked at his companions. 12 men, all that remained of a platoon that had numbered 40 when they had first dug these positions in June. Their faces were gray with dust and exhaustion, their eyes hollow from 7 weeks of bombardment and attrition, their uniforms stiff with dried mud and blood. They had no anti-tank weapons left. The Panzerfaust rockets had been expended days ago, the ammunition for the PaK-40 anti-tank gun had run out, and the gun itself had been destroyed by an American fighter bomber 2 weeks earlier. They had rifles, a single machine gun with half a belt of ammunition, and grenades that might as well have been pebbles for all the good they would do against armor. The sound grew louder. The trembling became violent. And then the first Sherman crested the rise directly ahead of the trench, its 30-ton bulk silhouetted against the smoke-filled sky, its 75 millimeters gun traversing slowly as if searching for targets worthy of its attention. It did not stop. It did not fire. It simply continued forward, and Hartmann realized with absolute clarity what was about to happen. The tank was not going around the trench. It was coming through it. The moment of impact arrived without ceremony. The Sherman's nose tilted downward as its front treads dropped into the trench, the weight of the machine pressing down with 30 tons of American steel. The trench walls, so carefully constructed with rivet timber and sandbags, collapsed inward like cardboard. The men who could not scramble clear in time simply disappeared beneath the treads, their screams, if they had time to scream, lost in the roar of the engine. The tank ground forward, its rear treads climbing out of the trench, its hull scraping across the earth where moments before men had sheltered, and then it was past, continuing its advance as if the trench and the men within it had been nothing more than a minor irregularity in the terrain. More tanks followed. One after another, they rolled through the trench line, crushing dugouts, collapsing communication tunnels, burying weapons and supplies and men beneath tons of earth and steel. Hartmann ran. He abandoned his rifle, his pack, everything that might slow him down, and he ran across the open ground toward the rear, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of bullets or shell fragments. But the Americans did not shoot at fleeing men. They simply continued their advance, methodical and unstoppable, flattening defensive works that had taken weeks to construct as if they were ant hills beneath a boot heel. He survived. Many did not. By nightfall, the German front line at St. Lo had ceased to exist, rolled over by an armored avalanche that marked the beginning of Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy that would send American armies racing across France toward the German border. But survival brought no relief, only the haunted knowledge that everything he had been taught about warfare, about German tactical superiority, about the ability of determined infantry to hold positions against armor, had been rendered obsolete in the span of a single morning. The Americans had not outfought them. They had simply buried them beneath a mass of steel, so overwhelming that fighting became irrelevant. What Hartmann and his comrades experienced in the trenches of Normandy was not merely tactical defeat, but a confrontation with a new kind of warfare. Warfare in which industrial capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance, in which quantity became its own quality, in which the ability to produce and deploy armor in crushing abundance redefined the very nature of battlefield dominance. The Sherman tank, maligned by historians and mocked by German panzer crews as inferior, proved in that moment to be something far more dangerous than a superior weapon. It was a symbol of American industrial might made mobile, a 30-ton messenger announcing that the war had already been decided by forces assembled in the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh and Gary, Indiana. The story of the Sherman tank begins not on the battlefields of Europe, but in the industrial heartland of America, in the desperate days following Pearl Harbor. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, its army possessed fewer than 400 modern tanks, most of them light models suitable for reconnaissance, but inadequate for combat against German armor. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, had spent years developing its panzer divisions, had battle-tested them in Poland and France, had refined its doctrine of combined arms warfare to a lethal edge. American military planners understood with sobering clarity that catching up would require not merely building tanks, but building them at a scale and speed that defied conventional industrial practice. The Sherman emerged from this imperative. Officially designated the M4 medium tank, it was not a revolutionary design, but rather a pragmatic one, engineered for mass production using automotive industry techniques. Its engine was a modified aircraft radial initially, later versions using diesel or gasoline engines assembled from mass-produced automotive components. Its armor was welded or cast using methods borrowed from shipbuilding. Its tracks used rubber salvaged from the tire industry. Its transmission employed technology from Caterpillar tractors. Every component was designed not for optimal performance, but for manufacturability, for the ability to be produced in vast quantities by workers who had been building cars the previous year and could be retrained in weeks rather than months. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. American factories produced 49,234 Sherman tanks between 1942 and 1945, an average of 41 tanks per day, every day, for 3.5 years. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal, built from scratch in Warren, Michigan, turned out its first Sherman in April 1942 and was producing 1,500 tanks per month by early 1943. The Fisher Body plant in Grand Blanc, Michigan, converted from automobile production to tank production in 6 months and became the largest tank factory in the world, its assembly lines running 3 shifts around the clock. Pressed Steel Car Company, which had built railroad cars in peacetime, produced Shermans at its Philadelphia plant. Pacific Car and Foundry in Washington State, Ford Motor Company in Michigan, even locomotive manufacturers like Baldwin and Lima, all were conscripted into tank production, their expertise in heavy machinery repurposed for war. This industrial mobilization was unprecedented in scale and speed. In 1941, American tank production totaled 4,052 vehicles. In 1942, it reached 24,997. In 1943, it peaked at 29,497. By comparison, German factories produced approximately 27,000 tanks of all types during the entire war, roughly half the Sherman production alone, to say nothing of American light tanks, tank destroyers, and other armored vehicles. The Soviet Union, with its emphasis on the T-34, produced more tanks than Germany, but still fell short of American output. Britain, struggling under bombing and resource constraints, produced about 5,000 medium tanks during the same period. The numbers told a story that transcended tactics. America could outbuild any opponent, and in modern industrial warfare, the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them was decisive. But the Sherman's significance lay not merely in its numbers, but in its distribution. Unlike German panzers, which were concentrated in elite armor divisions that received priority for fuel and spare parts, Shermans were issued liberally to armor divisions, to independent tank battalions attached to infantry divisions, to British and Canadian forces under Lend-Lease, to Free French units, even to the Soviet Union, which received over 4,000 Shermans despite its own tank production. They appeared everywhere the Western Allies fought, in North Africa and Italy, in Normandy and Belgium, in the Pacific Islands where their flamethrower variants incinerated Japanese bunkers. The Sherman became the ubiquitous face of American armored power, and its ubiquity was itself a psychological weapon that announced to Axis soldiers, "We can afford to be everywhere, and you cannot stop us." The German soldiers who had dug the trenches at St. Lo expected a different kind of battle. They had been told that the bocage country of Normandy, with its sunken roads and ancient hedgerows forming natural barriers every few hundred meters, was ideal defensive terrain, that American armor would be channeled and slowed, that German anti-tank weapons would pick off the Shermans one by one as they bottlenecked at choke points. The intelligence briefings had emphasized Sherman vulnerabilities. Its thin armor, penetrable by German 75mm and 88mm guns at long range. Its tendency to catch fire when penetrated, earning it the nickname Tommy Cooker from British crews and Ronson from Americans, after the cigarette lighter that advertised lights every time. Its inferior gun compared to the long-barreled 75mm and 88mm weapons mounted on German Panthers and Tigers. All of this was true as far as it went. In one-on-one engagements, a Panther or Tiger could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm gun was ineffective. German crews with proper training and positioning could achieve kill ratios of 5 or 6 to 1, sometimes higher. But this tactical calculus assumed finite numbers, assumed battles fought under conditions where German advantages in gunnery and armor could be brought to bear. Operation Cobra shattered those assumptions by rendering them irrelevant. When 1,000 Shermans advanced on a front held by perhaps 50 operational German tanks, when American armor could afford to lose 5 tanks for every German tank destroyed and still achieve overwhelming superiority, the mathematics of exchange ratios became meaningless. What the German soldiers experienced was not tank versus tank combat, but something closer to a natural disaster. An avalanche of steel that could not be stopped because destroying individual tanks accomplished nothing when 10 more immediately took their place. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance battalion in Normandy, recorded in his memoir the psychological impact of facing this abundance. "We destroyed Sherman after Sherman, but they kept coming. Our gunners achieved hits at long range. Our experienced crews outfought them tactically, but it made no difference. For every tank we destroyed, 5 more appeared. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. Eventually, we ran out of ammunition, or our position was flanked, or we were simply overwhelmed. The Americans could afford losses that would have crippled any other army. That was the true horror. Not that the Sherman was invincible, but that it was expendable." Another German officer, General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzerlehr Division, described the opening of Operation Cobra in testimony recorded after his capture. "By noon, Nothing was visible but dust and smoke. My entire front line was a boiling cauldron. I could not see my own command post. The bombing was bad enough, but when the tanks came, it was impossible to maintain any coherent defense. They simply rolled over our positions. Trenches that should have stopped tanks were crushed flat. Strong points that should have required infantry assault to reduce were bypassed or flattened. My men fought bravely, but what can brave men do against such material superiority? The experience of being in a trench when Sherman drove over it was something for which no training could prepare a soldier. The Wehrmacht had trained extensively for anti-tank defense, had developed tactics for engaging armor with handheld weapons, had drilled soldiers in the techniques of remaining calm under armored assault. But those tactics assumed the tank would stop, would be vulnerable to close assault, would present opportunities for counterattack. The Shermans in Operation Cobra did not stop. They did not pause to engage individual strongpoints. They simply advanced, and anything in their path was obliterated. Survivors described the sensation of the trench walls collapsing inward, of timber supports that had seemed solid snapping like twigs, of the daylight disappearing as the tank's hull passed overhead, of the earth pressing down with suffocating weight. Some men were crushed outright, their bodies buried beneath tons of collapsed earth and never recovered. Others suffocated in collapsed sections of trench, their lungs filling with dust, their screams unheard over the roar of engines. A fortunate few escaped by running, but running meant exposing oneself to machine gun fire from the tanks or from the American infantry that followed them. Men abandoning weapons and equipment meant joining the disorganized streams of refugees fleeing eastward in hope of reaching German lines that might not even exist anymore. The psychological impact of this experience extended far beyond the immediate trauma of survival. It shattered the myth of German invincibility that had sustained the Wehrmacht through years of war. The belief that superior training and tactical skill could compensate for numerical inferiority. The soldiers who fled the trenches at St. Lo carried with them the knowledge that courage and competence meant nothing against an enemy who could afford to lose 10 men for every German casualty and still win through sheer mass. This knowledge spread through the ranks like a contagion, undermining morale more effectively than any propaganda. Because it was not propaganda, it was lived experience, validated by the evidence of the senses. The transformation of American armor doctrine between 1942 and 1944 reflected a growing understanding that the Sherman's true strength lay not in dueling enemy tanks, but in its availability in overwhelming numbers and its mechanical reliability. Early American tank doctrine, influenced by British experience in North Africa, had emphasized tank versus tank combat, treating armored warfare as a form of cavalry charge translated to the 20th century. The battles at Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, where inexperienced American forces were badly mauled by German panzers, seemed to validate concerns that the Sherman was inadequate for modern warfare. But the lessons drawn from North Africa and Italy led not to a redesign of the Sherman, which would have required halting production and retooling factories at enormous cost, but to a reformation of doctrine. American commanders came to understand that the Sherman's role was not to seek out and destroy German tanks, but to exploit breakthroughs, to support infantry, to maintain mobility and tempo of operations. Tank destroyers with heavier guns would deal with enemy armor. Artillery and air power would suppress German anti-tank weapons. The Sherman's job was to keep moving, to maintain pressure, to exploit the American advantages in logistics and production by forcing the Germans to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. This doctrine reached its apotheosis in Operation Cobra. The plan, conceived by General Omar Bradley, called for massing armor to such a degree that breakthrough became inevitable, not through tactical brilliance, but through simple concentration of force. 7 divisions, including 3 armored divisions, would attack on a front of only 7,000 yards after the preliminary bombardment. The density of force was unprecedented, roughly 1 tank for every 7 yards of front, supported by fighter bombers and artillery in equally concentrated numbers. The intent was not to outmaneuver the Germans, but but to simply crush them beneath weight of metal and explosive to create not a clean breakthrough, but a collapse of the entire defensive system. The execution, despite initial confusion caused by bombs falling short and hitting American positions, succeeded beyond expectations. By the end of July 25th, the German front had been shattered. By July 27th, American armor had penetrated 15 miles beyond the start line and was ranging freely in the German rear, destroying supply columns and overrunning headquarters. By the end of July, the breakout was unstoppable. American tanks were racing across open country at speeds of 30 and 40 miles per day, their only limitation the capacity of supply lines to keep them fueled and armed. The Sherman's mechanical reliability proved crucial during this exploitation phase. German panzers, particularly the heavy Tigers and Panthers, were engineering marvels but maintenance nightmares, requiring skilled mechanics and specialized parts to keep running. A Panther needed its transmission serviced every 150 kilometers. A Tiger's final drive often failed after 500 kilometers. Both tanks consumed fuel at rates that strained German logistics, even in defensive operations. The Sherman, by contrast, was designed for durability. Its engine, transmission, and suspension were robust and easily maintained. Its tracks, though narrower than German designs, rarely broke. Its fuel consumption was modest. It could be repaired in the field by mechanics with basic tools and without specialized training. This reliability meant that Sherman units maintained operational readiness rates of 70 to 80%, meaning that 7 or 8 tanks out of 10 were available for combat at any given time. German armored units, by mid-1944, often struggled to keep 50% of their tanks operational. This disparity in readiness compounded the numerical disparity in production. Not only did America produce more tanks, but a higher percentage of those tanks were actually fighting at any given moment. The cumulative effect was crushing. German armor divisions that should have fielded 200 tanks were lucky to put 50 on the battlefield, while American armor divisions with authorization for 250 tanks often fielded 200 or more. The symbolic power of the Sherman extended beyond its tactical role to become an emblem of American industrial might and the democratic system that produced it. Unlike German panzers, which were often named after predatory animals, Tiger, Panther, Jagdpanther, suggesting a warrior ethos and emphasis on individual prowess, Shermans were named after a general, William Tecumseh Sherman, who had pioneered total war during the American Civil War and understood that modern conflict was decided by logistics and industrial capacity as much as by battlefield heroics. The choice of name was fitting. These were not warriors, but workers, industrial products designed for mass consumption and disposable utility. The crews who operated Shermans reinforced this democratic identity. They were not elite panzer troops selected for physical prowess and ideological reliability, but ordinary American citizens. Farm boys from Iowa, steelworkers from Pennsylvania, mechanics from Detroit, college students whose educations have been interrupted by the draft. They received good training, typically 6 months in the United States before deployment, but their training emphasized practical skills and teamwork rather than warrior mystique. They were taught to operate their tanks efficiently, to perform field maintenance, to work in coordination with infantry and artillery. They were not taught that they were supermen or members of a master race. They were simply soldiers doing a job. This democratic ethos permeated every aspect of Sherman operations. The tanks themselves were designed for crew comfort to a degree that German engineers would have considered wasteful. They had relatively spacious interiors. 5 men could work without constantly colliding with each other or with equipment. They had powered turret traverse, eliminating the exhausting manual cranking required in many German tanks. They had gyro stabilizers for the main gun, allowing reasonably accurate fire while moving, a capability no German tank possessed. The driver's position included shock-absorbing seats and adjustable controls designed with ergonomics in mind. These features did not directly enhance combat effectiveness, but they reduced crew fatigue and made the tank a more humane workplace, reflecting the American belief that soldiers were citizens whose comfort and safety mattered. The recurring symbol that came to represent this American abundance to German soldiers was not the tank itself, but something more prosaic: the rations found on destroyed or captured Shermans. American armored crews carried K-rations and C-rations, packages of canned food, crackers, candy, cigarettes, instant coffee, and chewing gum, all sealed in wax cardboard containers designed for durability and ease of distribution. To German soldiers subsisting on increasingly meager rations, ersatz coffee made from acorns, bread that contained sawdust, margarine that tasted of petroleum. The contents of an American ration box seemed like luxury goods from another civilization. Captured documents and post-war interviews reveal that German soldiers frequently discussed American rations with a mixture of envy and despair. One infantryman, writing to his wife in August 1944, described finding a destroyed Sherman. Inside were boxes of food such as I have not seen in years: meat in cans, real chocolate, white cigarettes that were not made from sawdust. The Americans feed their soldiers better than we feed our officers. How can we win a war against people who have so much they can afford to waste it on ordinary soldiers? Another soldier, interviewed after his capture, told his interrogators, "You could tell how badly we were losing by what we found on captured American vehicles. In 1943, we thought the rations were propaganda. Surely no army could afford to feed its men so well. By 1944, we understood it was real. You simply had more of everything than you needed. That was more demoralizing than the fighting itself. The canned ham and processed cheese, the Hershey bars and Lucky Strike cigarettes, became symbols of a disparity that transcended military capability. They represented an economic system so productive that it could afford to package individual meals for millions of soldiers with a variety and quality that exceeded what most German civilians were eating. They represented a society that valued its common soldiers enough to ensure they were well fed, that saw morale and welfare as components of military effectiveness rather than luxuries to be dispensed with under pressure. They represented, in their mass-produced ubiquity, the fundamental difference between a democracy marshaling its resources for victory and a dictatorship consuming itself in service of a collapsing ideology. The Sherman tanks that flattened the trenches at St. Lo carried these rations in their bustle racks and storage bins, and German soldiers who survived the armored onslaught and managed to scavenge from destroyed vehicles invariably searched for the food first, before weapons or equipment. The act of eating American rations while wearing a German uniform became a small but profound moment of recognition. This is what we are fighting against, and we cannot match it. The taste of real coffee and genuine chocolate, so ordinary to the Americans that they complain about rations being monotonous, was to German soldiers a revelation of the gulf between their condition and that of their enemies. By August 1944, the German army in France was in full retreat. Operation Cobra had achieved not merely a breakthrough, but a breakout. American armor had penetrated so deeply and moved so rapidly that entire German divisions were cut off and destroyed in the Falaise Pocket, where the roads became clogged with burning vehicles and the fields littered with abandoned equipment. The Seine was crossed in late August, Paris liberated, and by September, American tanks were approaching the German border itself. The Wehrmacht, which had begun the summer with 50 divisions in France, ended it with the shattered remnants of perhaps 15, having lost 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, and virtually all of its heavy equipment. The Sherman had not won this victory alone. American artillery, air power, and infantry all played crucial roles, but it had been the visible instrument of German defeat, the symbol that soldiers and civilians alike associated with the collapse of the Western Front. German commanders, analyzing the campaign in reports and post-war memoirs, consistently identified American material superiority in armor as the decisive factor. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, stated bluntly in Allied interrogation, "The Americans won through sheer weight of material. They had so many tanks that destroying them became futile. Our anti-tank weapons were adequate. Our tactics were sound, but we were simply buried beneath their production capacity." The Panzer commanders, who had prided themselves on their tactical excellence and the technical superiority of their Tigers and Panthers, found themselves in the bitter position of winning individual engagements while losing the larger campaign. Otto Carius, a Tiger tank ace with 150 credited tank kills, wrote in his memoir, "We would achieve impossible kill ratios, destroy enemy tanks at ranges they could not match, execute perfect ambushes, and still we would have to retreat because they had 10 more tanks for every one we destroyed." The Sherman was not a better tank than the Tiger, but there were always more Shermans. Always. That was what defeated us. Not better weapons, but more weapons, endlessly more, until we ran out of ammunition and fuel and crews. The psychological impact on German soldiers who survived the Normandy campaign lingered long after the guns fell silent. Klaus Hartmann, who had fled the trenches at St. Lo on July 25th, was captured in September near the German border. In the prisoner of war camp, he wrote an account of his experiences that was later preserved in Allied intelligence files. "I have nightmares still of the sound, the treads grinding, the engines roaring, the earth shaking as if the world were ending. I see the tanks in my sleep, waves of them, more than could be counted, more than could be stopped. I wake thinking I am buried beneath the collapsed trench, suffocating in the dark. We were told Germany could not be beaten, that our cause was just and our victory inevitable. The Americans did not defeat that belief with propaganda. They defeated it with steel, with so much steel that it buried our faith along with our trenches." Other survivors echoed this testimony. A common theme emerged in interrogation reports and captured letters. The experience of facing American armor in overwhelming numbers had destroyed not merely military cohesion, but ideological certainty. The Nazi regime had built its legitimacy on claims of German superiority, on the myth that discipline and will could overcome material disadvantages. The Sherman offensive proved this mythology false in a way that no amount of Allied propaganda could achieve, because it was not propaganda, but lived reality. The physical sensation of earth shaking, of steel advancing, of defenses that should have held being obliterated as if they had never existed. The Sherman's legacy extended beyond the immediate military impact of Operation Cobra to influence the post-war understanding of armored warfare and industrial mobilization. After 1945, military analysts and historians engaged in vigorous debate about the tank's merits. Critics pointed to its vulnerabilities, its inferior gun and armor compared to German heavy tanks, the high casualty rates among crews who fought in them. Proponents emphasized its reliability, its numerical superiority, its role in achieving strategic objectives regardless of tactical exchange ratios. The debate sometimes missed the larger point. The Sherman was not designed to be the best tank on the battlefield, but to be the most effective instrument of American industrial power, and in that role, it succeeded brilliantly. The production techniques pioneered for Sherman manufacturing became templates for post-war American industry. The modular assembly methods, the use of standardized components, the integration of subcontractors from diverse industries. All of these innovations that had been developed under wartime pressure proved applicable to peacetime production. The same factories that had built Shermans returned to building cars and trucks, carrying with them lessons in mass production efficiency that would sustain American industrial dominance for decades. The engineers who had designed the Sherman went on to design post-war tanks and armored vehicles, always with an eye toward manufacturability and reliability, always remembering that the best weapon was the one that could be produced in sufficient numbers to matter. For the soldiers who had crewed Shermans, the experience was more ambiguous. They had fought in machines they knew were inferior in some respects to enemy armor, had watched friends burn to death in knocked-out tanks, had climbed back into replacement Shermans knowing that survival was as much chance as skill. But they had also known that if their tank was destroyed, another would be available, that the logistical systems supporting them would replace losses, would provide fuel and ammunition, would sustain operations until victory was achieved. They had fought with the confidence that came from numerical superiority, from knowing that the enemy could not match American production no matter how many individual battles he won. This confidence, born of material abundance, distinguished the American experience of armored warfare from that of their German adversaries. Where German tank crews fought with the desperation of men who knew each loss was irreplaceable, American crews fought with the assurance that came from knowing they were backed by an industrial system of overwhelming capacity. This psychological advantage was as important as any technical specification, and it flowed directly from the Sherman's nature as a mass-produced weapon rather than a precision instrument. The German soldiers who had cowered in the trenches as Shermans rolled over them carried the memory of that moment for the rest of their lives. In post-war Germany, as the nation struggled to rebuild from ruins and to come to terms with the moral catastrophe of Nazism, veterans of Normandy would sometimes speak of the American armored offensive as the moment they understood the war was truly lost, not merely losing but lost beyond any possibility of redemption. The propaganda had spoken of wonder weapons that would turn the tide, of secret technologies and unbreakable German will. The reality had been Sherman tanks, hundreds of them, flattening defensive works and rolling eastward with unstoppable momentum, indifferent to losses, sustained by a productive capacity that seemed almost supernatural in its abundance. For the Americans who had fought in those Shermans, the memory was simpler but no less profound. They had been part of something larger than themselves, part of an industrial and military machine that had projected power across an ocean and a continent to destroy tyranny in its heartland. They had not always fought in the best equipment, had not always won individual engagements, but they had been sustained by a system that would not let them fail, that would replace every loss, that would provide fuel when fuel was needed and ammunition when ammunition ran low, that would ensure that numerical superiority eventually translated into victory. The lesson of St. Lo and Operation Cobra was not about the Sherman tank specifically, but about what it represented. The capacity of a democratic industrial state to mobilize resources on a scale that totalitarian regimes could not match, to sustain losses that would have broken less productive societies, to win through sheer application of material superiority even when tactical excellence favored the enemy. This lesson resonated beyond World War II, informing American strategic thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond. The belief that economic strength and industrial capacity were as important as military prowess, that wars were won in factories as much as on battlefields. Epilogue: The Earth remembers. 8 decades have passed since the Sherman tanks rolled through the hedgerows of Normandy, since the trenches at St. Lo were flattened and buried, since the German Wehrmacht began its final retreat toward oblivion. The battlefields have long since returned to peaceful agriculture. Wheat grows where tanks once fought, cattle graze in fields that were once cratered by bombs. The trenches have been filled in, the hedgerows replanted, the physical scars healed by time and nature's patient work. The men who fought there, American and German alike, have mostly passed into history, their stories preserved in memoirs and archives, but fading from living memory with each year that separates us from their time. Yet the earth remembers. Farmers plowing fields in Normandy still occasionally unearth fragments of tanks, a section of tread, a piece of armor plate, the rusted hulk of an engine block buried 6 feet down. Museums across France display Shermans recovered from hedgerows and restored to running condition, their engines still capable of producing that deep rumble that once signified American power advancing. And in the memories of the few remaining survivors, now in their late 90s or beyond, the sensation persists, the ground trembling, the sky dark with smoke, the overwhelming presence of armor advancing in waves that seem to have no end. The lesson of the Sherman was never about the superiority of American engineering or the excellence of American tactics. It was about something more fundamental, the power of industrial democracy to mobilize resources in defense of liberty, to translate economic capacity into military might, to sustain a global war effort while simultaneously maintaining domestic prosperity. The Sherman embodied this power not despite its flaws, but through them. It was good enough, producible enough, reliable enough to win, and winning was what mattered. The German soldiers who were stunned by the Sherman offensive learned a truth that their regime had denied. That will and ideology could not overcome material reality. that superior training and tactical skill meant nothing against an enemy who could afford to lose 5 tanks for every German tank destroyed and still emerge victorious. That modern industrial war was decided not by warrior virtues, but by production capacity and logistical sustainability. This was a bitter lesson for men who had been taught to believe in German superiority, but it was a lesson written in steel and high explosive across the landscape of France, impossible to deny or ignore. For the rest of the world, particularly for the Soviet Union and the nascent Cold War rivals who watched American power projection with wary eyes, the Sherman Offensive provided a demonstration of what industrial democracy could achieve when existentially threatened. The tank itself might have been merely adequate, but the system that produced 49,000 of them in 3 years, that deployed them across multiple theaters simultaneously, that sustained them with fuel and ammunition and spare parts delivered across oceans and continents. That system was formidable in a way that transcended any individual weapon. The sound of Sherman engines has long since faded from the fields of Normandy. The rumble that once signified terror to German soldiers and hope to French civilians is now preserved only in recordings and in the memories of those who heard it. But the truth that sound represented remains relevant. That free societies, when pushed to the brink, possess reserves of strength that tyrannies cannot match. That abundance is a weapon as potent as any gun. That the capacity to produce and to sustain and to replace is what ultimately determines victory in modern war. The earth remembers, and in remembering, it teaches us still. The farmers who plow around rusted tank hulks, the historians who study faded battle maps, the few remaining veterans who can still hear the engines in their dreams, all carry forward a lesson written in steel and blood. That freedom, when defended by abundance, is an unstoppable force, and that the 30-ton Shermans that flattened German trenches were not merely machines of war, but symbols of a truth larger than warfare itself. They were democracy made mobile, industrial capacity weaponized, American power announced with the thunder of engines and the grinding of treads against earth that would never forget.